Thanks for the intro, Stevie. I'm Liz Murnane. I'm a postdoc in computer science at Stanford, and today I'll be presenting work that was done in collaboration with Mark Matthews from Cornell and Jamie Snyder from the University of Washington. We're motivated by this idea that there's been a recent increase in the development of digital self-tracking tools that support personal informatics and quantified self activities aimed at really helping individuals examine various facets of their lives and bodies through their personal data. But when it comes to self-tracking in a context of mental health and mental illness, like bipolar disorder, we still don't know enough about the self-tracking practices and needs of individuals with these conditions. And that's knowledge that's really important if we want to design better tools that enable people to play a meaningful role in self-management. And so my goal is that by the end of this talk, you'll have a better understanding of how people with bipolar disorder, at least in our sample, are self-tracking and why, what they want to get out of it. What those personal data practices actually look like in everyday life, and then putting that together, some new perspectives around the design of self-tracking systems that address these needs while remaining highly sensitive to the vulnerabilities of this population. So to begin with a bit of background, our work specifically focuses on the serious mental illness of bipolar disorder, or BD. So it's one of the 10 most debilitating illnesses worldwide. It affects 60 million people globally. And while medication and therapy can help to reduce the symptoms of BD, it is chronic. So people expect to manage the condition for a lifetime, with each relapse potentially causing permanent neurological damage. Now, the central characteristic to BD is mood, dramatic shifts in mood. So this slide illustrates, the extreme ends of these mood episodes, separated by balanced periods of normal moods. So from deep depressions that's worse than anyone without BD could imagine, that involve distinct changes in sleep and eating patterns, a lack of any activity, social withdrawal, general sense of emptiness, to the manic highs, over on the right, that involve racing thoughts, irritability, impulsive risk-taking behavior. And like most other psychiatric conditions, BD has no objective instruments. There's no tests for assessing it. And so patient-reported experiences to self-track factors considered clinically relevant, like mood and adherence to medication, play a major role in diagnosis and treatment. And so this practice dates back to the 1833 moral thermometer over on the left, to today's instruments like the NIMH's Life Chart or the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology. And now we've got a host of digital tracking technologies emerging, wearable devices and smartphone apps, and while they target a mainstream audience, there is initial evidence that people with BD are taking up these self-tracking tools in an effort to manage their condition. But regardless of the method, there's a lack of understanding of people's self-tracking behaviors, including what's working and what's not working, along with their patient-centric motives for tracking beyond the clinician-oriented conceptions of self-tracking and treatment. And so to address this, we ran a study specifically aimed at the following 3 research questions. So how and why do participants engage in self-tracking using any method? And then, this is an important one, how does their illness impact self-tracking practices? And then finally, what are their attitudes and thoughts on the potential of technology to support these activities over time? So we had a sample of 10 individuals, 5 females, 5 males, between 25 and 64 years old, who had confirmed diagnosis of bipolar disorder, no active suicidal ideation, and consented to participate. So we recruited through a clinic run by the University of Pittsburgh, where our clinical collaborators were based, and we engaged with participants through a series of semi-structured interviews that Mark Matthews conducted, as well as through email correspondence and 2 surveys. And all of our interview questions and survey materials are provided in the paper's appendix if you'd like to see them or reuse them. And then all 3 researchers, Mark, Jamie Snyder, and myself, transcribed and analyzed these data to identify themes through an iterative, collaborative open coding. Okay, so let's just get right into the findings. So the first thing I want to do is tell you some personal stories, some vignettes that illustrate participants self-tracking in their daily lives. So these will foreshadow the thematic analysis to come, but they'll also provide a richer, more experiential, holistic context. And there are more vignettes in the paper, but today I'll tell you 2 in an abbreviated fashion, and these aren't composites. These are each real individuals, but these are pseudonyms to protect anonymity. So first, let me tell you about Rachel. So Rachel's got type 1 BD. That means she experiences both full mania and depression. She experienced her first episode about 25 years ago at the time of the interview, so she's been managing her condition quite a while. She's got a master's degree in social work. She considers herself very stable, largely crediting her highly structured schedule for keeping her BD under control. She started tracking around the time of her first episode using paper. She'd share the materials with her doctors. But now that she's stabilized, she says she only shares her tracking data when she's having problems. And she says tracking helps her recognize patterns so that she can make adjustments to restabilize. Rachel's a self-declared tech enthusiast. She has a bunch of apps on her iPod, but she doesn't really think they're too helpful because she tracks a lot of idiosyncratic items and the apps aren't customizable enough. So she's created her own tool, which is this totally boss spreadsheet in Excel that allows her to track all the elements that she believes are the most important to her self-management. And she also has a simple macro that gives her personalized messages of encouragement based on hitting certain target patterns in her data. So this would qualify as an elaborate custom tracking setup if I ever saw one. And then David, let me tell you about David, another wonderful participant, but David's story is a little different. So David got diagnosed about 2 years ago at the time of the interview when he was on federal probation. So his probation officer had noticed David had never held a job for more than a year. He saw several other indicators of erratic behavior in David's past. And so we ordered a psych exam that resulted in a BD and anxiety diagnosis. And David actually told us, I knew something was there, I just didn't know what it was. And he said the diagnosis actually really helped him start making sense of his life. So after diagnosis, he got medication, established habits that let him start gaining control of his life, enough to identify triggers and behavioral techniques for coping. He started doing martial arts, and now his main concern is reaching and maintaining stability. So he uses a standard clinical paper-based form, the social rhythm metric, as you can see here, which he thinks is helpful. But he thinks the paper form is hard to keep with him, which is a problem because David tends to forget things easily, which is similar to a lot of people with BD. So he uses alarms on his phone, digital calendars to remind himself of things to track. And recently he got a watch that monitors heart rate and steps and calories. And he says he wishes a tool existed that could take all that information and figure out what triggers his depressive episodes. So as I mentioned, those vignettes foreshadow a number of the themes I'll discuss now, and in distilling them down, I'm going to organize the themes around those 3 research questions that motivated the study. So first, how and why do participants engage in self-tracking? So first on the how, all of our participants engaged in self-tracking, which is not too surprising because we recruited relatively stable people, part of a treatment program. Most were introduced to self-tracking by their clinicians, although a number of participants did independently start using spreadsheets and calendars or mobile apps as part of self-management. And tracking practices were often the most elaborate and intense just after diagnosis as part of establishing new tracking habits and a baseline of normal. So now we're starting to get into the why. What are the motives? Where's the value? So first we found that while participants use a combination of methods to self-track, the central goal was maintaining normalcy and self-stabilizing, as opposed to optimizing performance or achieving an aspirational goal, like we might see for quantified selfers or other self-trackers in a general population. Self-tracking also became a way of counterbalancing the loss of autonomy and sense of being out of control brought on by their illness, so tracking really let them exert control over their bipolar. And individuals also sought to identify patterns early on to anticipate mood episodes. They perform personal analytics kind of by sifting through their data to make connections between behaviors and symptoms and warning signs. And then lastly, aside from identifying patterns and warning signs, several participants felt that the act of self-tracking had value in and of itself by supporting an increased mindfulness and an intentionality about maintaining therapeutic behavioral targets. But we also found that these positive associations with self-tracking were complicated by the symptoms of bipolar, like extreme mood fluctuations, which can make it difficult to establish and recognize a stable behavioral baseline. Which brings us to our second question and corresponding set of themes. So how does the experience of bipolar disorder influence self-tracking practices? So first, the experience of bipolar colors many aspects of life. And so participants felt a desire to gain a greater sense of control via rigorous self-tracking. And so even though clinical BD treatment usually advocates recording data about a few specific behaviors like sleeping and medication, many participants also recorded a host of other variables to encompass pretty much anything that they perceived could affect their condition. But BD's fluctuating mood states were associated for participants with experiences of confusion or contradiction and self-doubt, which means BD can seriously impact the reliability of any collected data. Also, adherence to these tracking activities became deeply entangled with the syncopated rhythms of the illness, so a mood transition away from a stable state could undermine the desire to track. Poor adherence could also be a precursor of a mood episode. But it can be a delicate balance between tracking enough to maintain stability but not so excessive as to lead to extreme self-scrutiny that individuals with BD are vulnerable to. And so for several participants, clinicians facilitated this process of becoming comfortable and proficient with self-monitoring without going overboard, though others mentioned looking to technology to provide this kind of support, especially when they didn't have access to a doctor. And that brings us to our third and final question about technology. So, and the fact was our study highlighted how self-tracking could bring both therapeutic benefit but also psychological risk. So in terms of benefit, digital apps for self-tracking were perceived as promoting adherence due to a sense of accountability. One person described the app they used like a constant companion that they didn't want to let down. Programmable alarms and reminders were also seen as a way to increase adherence to self-tracking practices, as well as to prompt self-reflection and other therapeutic activities. And then going one step further towards automation, passive sensor technologies were perceived favorably, like an objective witness, more accurate and honest, and less susceptible to those personal biases. And then given that bipolar is a lifelong condition, this does seem a natural fit with sensing techniques that could relieve the ongoing burden of manual tracking. But, and then this starts to get into the risks, I'll come back to that last benefit bullet in a minute, there were mixed feelings about whether the primary value of self-tracking practices came from the resulting data or the act of reflecting on one's current state as part of more manual, deliberate, sometimes laborious self-reporting. So beyond such issues of agency and control, participants also expressed specific concerns about privacy in relation to automated or semi-automated sensing approaches. And they also expressed an awareness of the limitations of sensing technology, and they really considered accuracy disclaimers to be crucial information to convey, especially to new users, for the sake of transparency. They also pointed out that having technology in their lives provides access actually to a world of temptations, including overuse of social media and online shopping, gambling, other obsessive behaviors that are known to potentially fuel or trigger symptoms in BD. Plus, a lot of conventional self-tracking apps incorporate social media features for sharing success or receiving feedback, but people with BD also often felt these features contributed to feelings of shame or demoralization. And then finally, all participants reported that positive feedback was highly motivating. You know, remember Rachel built that into her custom Excel setup. But at the same time, participants felt that feedback framed in a negative or judgmental way would have just the opposite effect and could even exacerbate symptoms and usually led to abandonment of those tools. So in my remaining few minutes, I just want to leave you with a few parting thoughts around specific design directions we believe it would be desirable for QS tools in a mental health context to pursue. So again, self-tracking, personal informatics, quantified self, in a general population, these practices are typically aimed at increasing self-knowledge through collection, quantification, and interpretation of personal data with the ultimate goal of improving some aspect of daily functioning. But while our participants do engage in some of these QS activities, self-tracking in the BD context was less about obtaining information to optimize and more about stability and maintaining normalcy. So, you know, in a typical QS context, a 0 day is far from desirable. You know, 0 steps, a 0 sleep hygiene score. But for people with bipolar, no change is the improvement. And having an unremarkable day actually requires an enormous amount of time and energy and discipline. And so this is a very different paradigm to design for, right? Not only to avoid normative scales, but to target and celebrate stasis. Another unique aspect to self-tracking in the BD context is not only is it less about self-knowledge for self-improvement, but for these individuals, it can be hard to know what the self even means here. You know, self-tracking is also often undertaken in an effort to find and accept a self that's in flux and volatile. So even though the research is still limited, there is evidence that BD can negatively impact identity formation. It can interfere with developing a clear sense of self, because contradictions in the experiences of the self across these different mood states can lead to confusion over what's the true self. Plus, the person can have difficulties with self-acceptance, you know, due to an inability to integrate these different experiences and develop a stable sense of identity. And so we see this as an area where self-tracking could help both to target specific factors associated with an underdeveloped sense of identity and also facilitate these processes of self-construction and acceptance. And then finally, researchers studying the growth of personal informatics tools and self-tracking practices have conceptualized tracking as this 5-stage iterative process of preparation and collection, integration, reflection, action, through which individuals capture and act upon information, with some expansions of the model to include things like maintenance phases or lapse periods. And so synthesizing that foundation from the personal informatics literature with a staging model of bipolar disorder from the clinical literature, along with the phases of self-tracking identified by our participants, we propose this following progression for self-tracking in the context of bipolar disorder. So pre-diagnosis, there's no tracking. Maybe there's a little bit of light self-initiated tracking about mainstream lifestyle variables. Then the post-diagnosis phase begins shortly after diagnosis, preparing and initiating formal tracking, usually at a clinician's behest for discovery to gain control to maintain stability. Then during maintenance, a person engages in self-motivated tracking of therapeutic and personally relevant variables with a priority on adherence. And in our model, lapse stages are characterized by unreliable or sporadic or diminished, abandoned tracking, often resulting from fluctuating moods that cause distorted perceptions of self and interfere with an individual's ability to self-track. And then we call out an internalization stage, which is deliberately decreased or discontinued instrument-based tracking, potentially replaced by mental check-ins, once awareness of personal patterns is established and symptoms are reduced enough due to medication or behavior-based therapies. And then finally, we include a targeted stage that reflects resumed, increased, or more vigilant tracking during stressful periods or to recover from a mood episode. And we know BD is rarely predictable, it's often multi-directional, and so we've seen in the narratives of our participants that stages can be skipped, going from maintenance to internalization, looping around. But this framework at least captures an initial understanding, we think, of the evolving goals and intentions and value of self-tracking at different points in the life cycle of a bipolar diagnosis. And we think an agile, semi-automated approach is one of the best ways to support this, with systems moving back and forth between fully manual and wholly automated, tracking according to the phases of a person's illness as they transition in and out of condition states and tracking stages. But overall, we think our study indicates that people with bipolar disorder can be very engaged in the management of their illness, and that self-tracking tools can serve a vital role in this process if designed with these kind of guidelines and people's unique sensitivities in mind. So with that, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Mark and Jamie and the NSF and the European Funding Commission and most of all our participants. And thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to take questions, or feel free to email me at any point.
Hey, Liz. Great job. So can you give us a little bit of more insight what it means to celebrate stability? I think it's a fundamental understanding of, keeping a normal tracking. Do we need some kind of parametric approach? Should we use the mean, the mode? Should we use a running average? Should we show them just the last value? Because it's hard, right? Things variate, fluctuate. What does it mean to celebrate stability? Because that fine line just doesn't happen in life.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's very different for different people as well, depending on the type of condition you have, or even, again, going back to this model, depending on what stage of your condition, but also your stage of management you're in. Staying within bounds, we consistently saw, but what the range of that bounds for any given individual might be, it can be wildly different. And so first even defining those thresholds, and then figuring out a way to try to help people track to stay within them, but also frame feedback in a way that, as long as you're kind of staying good enough, it's positive.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. That was great.
Thank you.
So I have a question about defining what to track. So how did your participants do that? And did they often, if the clinician was initiating it, I'm sure it was more like clinically relevant metrics, but what about like things that trigger bipolar, or if they might have someone in their support system that can help them identify and reflect back? Yeah. How does that interplay with them doing the self-tracking and setting it up in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely when it's initiated by the clinician, it typically focuses on, again, these things like medication and sleep. And we saw, at least in our participants, tracking kind of anything under the sky they could think of at first, to try to shake out what exactly were their primary triggers, or figuring out patterns wherever they might be. And in many cases we did see a loved one or a doctor being the person who might identify something, and in many cases those were things that we don't currently have a way to capture, maybe automated in any automated fashion via a wearable or something like that. And that was one thing people expressed a desire for somehow to have technology step in kind of that role that a caretaker might, in sort of that intelligent observation sort of a role, to identify additional things to be mindful of.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we're right on time. It's 12:20 now. Thank you, Liz, for your talk, and thank you guys all for hanging out and coming and watching some of these really great talks. Just to let you know, lunch ends at 2. and then the next round of sessions, so 2 or 1,400, I guess if you work on a 24-hour clock rather than a 12. So thank you guys.